Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Halloween horror movie review. Today we're going to be talking about 1935's Werewolf of London. Quite an important film in werewolf lore, because a lot of the common tropes and such that we now associate with the werewolf legend actually originated from this movie. They're actually not a part of the original folklore upon which all these werewolf movies claim to be based. So let's take a look. Werewolf of London, today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Now, some people say that Werewolf of London is the first ever werewolf movie. Those people are wrong. The first ever werewolf movie was actually a silent film, all 18 glorious minutes of it, from 1913, called simply The Werewolf. And it drew a little bit more on Navajo legends of the werewolf and lycanthropy and so forth. And it's a classic revenge tale. Sadly, it no longer exists. It is one of many films that were destroyed in a fire in 1924. Gotta love the flammability of nitrate film, eh? The next one was in 1925, another silent film, this time called Wolf's Blood, in which a logger is mortally wounded and gets a blood transfusion of wolf's blood. There's then a series of mysterious murders throughout the camp for which he is blamed because they think he's become a werewolf because of the transfusion, I guess. Because, yeah, you know, transfusions, I guess, were new at the time, so they didn't know that you can't really just take any old blood and pump it into somebody, but hey, you know, science. So finally, 10 years later, we get Werewolf of London, starring Henry Hull and Warner Oland. The first proper werewolf movie, if you will. Yeah, a lot of the familiar elements of werewolf lore actually originated with this film, such as you become a werewolf by getting bitten by another werewolf. You become a werewolf uncontrollably and against your will every time there's a full moon. The werewolf itself is a half-man, half-beast, representing the worst sides of both. So none of those elements are actually a part of traditional werewolf lore. If you actually dive into the mythology, more commonly it's to do with witchcraft, where someone wants to gain this ability to become a wolf. And it's not that they become a wolf man, they literally transform into a wolf. And it's not always just a wolf, sometimes it's other animals or other forms as well. But it's more to do with witchcraft and that sort of thing, spell casting and gaining the ability to intentionally transform when and if you choose. It's nothing to do with the full moon, it's nothing to do with being bitten by another one. It's just something you brought on yourself by meddling with supernatural forces. So Henry Hull plays Dr. Wilfred Glendon, a botanist who is out in Tibet searching for a rare flower that he heard about called the Mariphasa lupine lumina. And the interesting thing about this flower is, unlike other flowers, it doesn't bloom in sunlight. It blooms in moonlight. So he wants to get a specimen to take back with him and to study. He's got quite a lot of rare plants in his collection, and he wants to examine this one. So he finds a specimen, but no sooner does he find it and he's about to collect it than he is attacked by a werewolf. He survives the attack and brings the flower back with him to London and begins to study. He's using artificial moonlight to try to prompt it to bloom. Now, during an exhibition of some of his other rare plants, he meets a Dr. Yogami, played by Warner Oland, who is also interested in this same flower. And he says, yeah, we met in Tibet briefly in the dark. And, I mean, unless you're half asleep, you immediately know, oh, he's the werewolf. But the thing that was interesting to me is that's not the important part of the story. I mean, any other movie would have made it a big mystery who the other werewolf is, but they just basically throw it in your face the second this character shows up, because it's not important. What is important is the fact that Dr. Yagami knows that because he attacked Dr. Glendon is going to become a werewolf as well, like he is. So the interesting thing about the Mariphasa is it actually acts as an antidote for werewolfery. Yeah, later movies would call it werewolfism or lycanthropy. This one, for whatever reason, they went with werewolfery, which just, yeah. They were still working out the kinks in the lore, okay? So, essentially, it becomes a story of Dr. Glendon trying to come to terms with the fact that he's suddenly turning into a werewolf every time there's a full moon, and trying to understand his condition and how the Mariphasa might be able to help him. Meanwhile, Dr. Yagami also wants the Mariphasa. He brought some specimens back with him from Tibet as well, but they all died in transit. So Dr. Glendon's specimens are the only ones in London that are still alive and are of any use to him. So he wants to find a way to cultivate the plant locally so that it can be used as an ongoing antidote for himself and Dr. Glendon and presumably anyone else who is afflicted with werewolfery. The problem is Dr. Glendon doesn't particularly want to share his discovery and doesn't want to work with him, so there ends up being a conflict there. The thing I found interesting about it is Dr. Yagami isn't necessarily evil. He's just afflicted with the same thing that Dr. Glendon is. If they had just worked together, they probably could have both benefited from it. So I found it interesting that Dr. Yagami essentially went straight to him and approached him and didn't come right out and say it, but the implication was there that, yeah, I'm the one that attacked you. I didn't really know what I was doing, but that's the nature of being a werewolf, and this plant can help us. But Dr. Glendon, full of pig-headed pride, also dealing with a bride who keeps going off for fun adventures with her ex-boyfriend, he's a little distracted and not quite thinking clearly. So it becomes a story of him trying to deal with all the personal stuff of dealing with his wife and his ex-boyfriend who's shown up and who's obviously trying to lure her away. She's not having any of it. She loves Dr. Glendon, but still, he's a constant presence and an irritation. Meanwhile, Dr. Yagami keeps pushing for helping with the Mariphasa, and he pushes him away, so Dr. Yagami just ends up stealing some of the plants for himself. So Dr. Glendon does come to realize that, yes, indeed, he is a werewolf, and he accepts it and decides to do some research on his own about it. So between what he learned from Dr. Yagami and what he was able to find out on his own, we find out a few more aspects of the lore as it appears in this movie, one of which is the werewolf needs to kill a person every night that he transforms. Otherwise, he will be trapped in werewolf form forever. So if he wants to be able to return to human form the next morning, he needs to kill someone every night that he becomes a werewolf. Now, that's an aspect of it I kind of wish they'd kept, to be honest, because one thing I've always kind of scratched my head about with a lot of werewolf movies is what is the motivation of the werewolf to kill? Is it just that he becomes a mindless beast, or is it that there's something more to it? In this case, they gave a reason. You have to kill, or you will stay in werewolf form forever. So it's a means of kind of keeping the curse at bay, in a way. So at least you know if you kill somebody, you'll become human again the next day. Now, the Mariphasa is not a cure. It's an antidote. If you think of it kind of like a vaccine that keeps an illness in check, that's kind of what this does. Is they would take the bloom and scratch themselves with it to get, some of the pollen, I guess, into their bloodstream, and it would prevent the transformation, but only for a few hours. So Dr. Glendon only brings a few blooms back with him, so he needs to find a way to cultivate this. Otherwise, that's it. He's doomed. So it's only going to last so long. Meanwhile, Dr. Yagami takes several of the blooms, so he has even fewer that he can use. So there's a real sense of urgency where he's desperately trying to figure out what's happening to him, understand it, and figure out if there's some way to deal with it. Well, in his explorations of werewolf mythology and lore, he does find a cure. However, the cure is he has to kill the thing he loves the most. So in this case, it would be his wife. If he kills his wife, he will be cured. So that's Werewolf of London. As to where it all ends up, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. But I gotta say, I really liked it a lot, and I've rewatched it a few times, and every time I see it, it's fascinating to me to see the origins of werewolf lore as we know it now, and kind of see where it all began, and see the seeds of the ideas that would later become a standard part of werewolf lore. The whole thing about being bitten and the full moon transformation and whatnot, that's become so completely ingrained in werewolf lore that I think a lot of people assume by this point that just comes out of the mythology. But it actually doesn't. It comes from this film. It comes from Werewolf of London. That's where it originated. That is ground zero for the whole get bitten, you'll become a werewolf every time the full moon is bright in the sky. Kind of like how in Nosferatu, the 1922 silent film, that's where the whole vampire vulnerability to sunlight came from. That's not from Dracula. That's from Nosferatu. I have to say that's one of the things that I found really personally fascinating as I've been doing these reviews and going back through these old films, is seeing how a lot of the common tropes that we take for granted now started, like where they actually began. So this one was no exception. There's some pretty big ones started with this movie. So it's strange to me that so few people seem to talk about this one. They all talk about the Lon Chaney one from 1941, but they don't talk about this one. Now, in terms of some of the behind-the-scenes tidbits, interesting to note, the makeup was originally going to look like this. And yes, it was designed by Jack Pierce, the Universal Monsters makeup man extraordinaire, but it was originally going to look like this. This was his original makeup design for Werewolf of London. But there's a few stories as to what happened, one of which is that Henry Hull himself objected to the makeup because it obscured too much of his face, and he wanted to be recognizable. And Jack Pierce stood his ground, and then Henry went over his head to the studio execs, and the studio execs forced him to change the makeup so that Henry's face would be more visible. That's one story. Henry Hull himself has denied that in interviews. The other story is that it was actually the studio itself asked Jack Pierce to tone it down because they were afraid that this makeup would somehow cause censorship issues. I don't fully understand. But something to do with movie censorship at the time. That if it was too bestial, it wouldn't be passed by the censors. So, I don't know. We'll probably never know what the real story was. But the only thing we know for sure is that this was the original makeup design, and it ended up being changed by the time they did the movie. Oh well. Now we have two early Wolfman designs, which are kind of cool. I know I've talked to some other fans, and some have said they actually prefer the old Werewolf of London design because it allows for more expression in the face. I don't know. It really is a matter of personal preference, I think. I should mention also another difference with the way the werewolf is in this. In later iterations of werewolf films, including the 1941 version actually, when the person transforms into a werewolf, they become much more beast than man, at least in terms of their mental capacity and such. In Werewolf of London, he actually retains much of his mental capacity, and in fact, in one scene of the movie, he even speaks quite clearly and eloquently, so it's like he still has his intelligence, but he's more feral. So there's this animal side that's added rather than replaced his intelligence. So he can still speak, he can still think. In fact, in one of the early scenes when he transforms, it's raining out, so he puts on a hat and coat. Yes, you see the werewolf put on a hat and coat before he goes out into the cold, chill night air. So, yeah, it's interesting to see those little differences and things that were kept and things that were changed. So, yeah. Well, we'll be watching a lot more werewolf movies over the course of the Halloween season. I've got quite a stack of them that I'd like to check out, not the least of which being the rest of the ones in this set. And, so I hope you'll tune in for those. And speaking of which, if you want to add this set to your collection, you will find Amazon links in the description, both to the individual Wolfman Legacy set and the 30-film Universal Monsters set as well, so whichever you prefer. I think the 30-film set's probably a better overall value if you don't have any of the other sets. I bought these as they came out, so I just ended up getting all the individual sets. So it's entirely up to you. It's the same contents either way. Alrighty, well, that is it for this review. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you for the next one. So until then, thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors. Be sure to catch me on Twitch. I stream just about every day. And I'll see you next time. Until then, sayonara. Yeah, this is kind of an important one, and one that you don't see them people. Welcome back. So Werewolf of London holds the Guinness Book of World Records for most beer drunk in a single sitting. The next one was in 1925, a little film called Wolf's Blood, in which there's a bunch of fucking shit goes on. Wolf's Blood, in which a lager does stuff. So then 10 years later, 1935, we got another movie. So much so that fucking shit. So finally, in 1935, we get Werewolf of London from Universal. And yeah, it's pretty good. So watch it. A lot of the familiar tropes of the werewolf legend and werewolf lore and werewolf films that followed came from this movie. They all started right here in this movie. Not this movie. The other one in this set. We're in that phase where I'm getting into my groove. Have to get my grove on. It's more to do with the intent to become a wolf and to fucking hell. Meraphasa lupine lumina. Meraphasa lupine lumina. What the fuck is Henry Hall's character's name? The Meraphasa lupine lumina. Yeah, bit of a mouthful. Later, basically kind of turned into Wolfsbane, which is way easier to say and sounds way more werewolf movie-y. The Meraphasa lupine lumina. I don't want to cut there. I want to keep talking after. So it's just like, I just blurted that out effortlessly. Because he heard about a rare flower there that he wants, because it's rare. So he finds a specimen. So it's interesting to me, and this is one of the things I've found really fascinating going through these films for these reviews, is I put my leg up and you can see my bare leg, so we'll just